November. And to me, November means we survived hurricane season, y'all. We got through it. I'll tell you, I don't know about you, but I get so uptight and so worried and everything whenever they say, oh, it's May. Next month is June. Make your preparations. It's hurricane season. And I just hate that because I know what that means, all the long lines and everybody in there trying to get all the water and things like that. And it's even worse, isn't it, whenever somebody waits till the last day or something, and then you go and there's no water, and everybody's fighting for things. It's worse than Black Friday. Well, what do we see often whenever we are talking about hurricane preparation? You know, there's all kinds of people. There are those people who make no preparations. They don't do anything. Now, I'm just going to ride the storm out. I love that picture of the Florida man standing out there with the flag braced, you know, against the wind like that. That's not real smart, especially if a billboard comes flying by. In this case, a lot of times, people who make no preparations are the ones who perish. You know, in 1928, there was a horrible hurricane that came through Lake Okeechobee, and over 2,500 people died who were unprepared. In fact, that storm killed more than 4,000 people total. Since then, they've made all kinds of preparations so that that will never happen again. You see also in hurricane preparation, those that are too late in their preparations. They may have started, but then by the time the storm is upon them, it's too late. And often they're the ones who wind up perishing as well. There are those who are not prepared enough. They only do partial preparations, and a lot of times they will lose life and property as well. And then, of course, there's those who are prepared. Those who do everything necessary to prepare for a storm, and they're the ones who may lose property, but at least they get out of it with their life. Friends and brethren, that's what this is all about. We're talking about preparation. We're talking about survival. And there's a biblical concept that goes along with that. In fact, the Bible even teaches that very subject in that very way. I want you to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 24. Today we're going to look at 2 chapters in the Bible of Jesus and His teaching in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 25, where He talks about that very thing, about being prepared. And He goes on and He teaches that there are different types of people in the way that they prepare. Now chapter 24 and 25 should always be studied together. They're a unit. And a lot of people don't study it that way, or they don't read it that way, and so therefore there's been a lot of confusion, there's been a lot of misrepresentation, there's been a lot of false teaching that's come out of looking at it as a whole unit. And it is taught in different ways, there's different parables in it, but if you look at it together, you will see that Jesus is indeed teaching about preparation, and He knows that people don't listen very well, and so He gives these different scenarios of the types of people and their preparation. That's what I want to look at this morning. I pray that it'll make you think about your preparation. Jesus is teaching this, and I hope it will help you see and realize that you need to do the same thing. So as we begin, we start in that first section, chapter 24, verses 1 through 39. And no, there's no way I'm going to be able to hit on every single verse and give you every single detail about these 2 chapters. But I want to give you as much as I can, so at least you can take this information and maybe go home and study it on your own. But as we begin in verse 1 of chapter 24, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and His disciples came to Him to show Him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, Do you not see all these things? Surely I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Wow. Jesus just dropped a bombshell, didn't He? You think about the disciples alongside Jesus. You know, Andrew and I and Mike and Patsy just got back from Italy, and we were there in Rome, and we got to see the Roman Forum, where you see all of that incredible architecture that's just really just the crumbs of that architecture. And then we went over to the Vatican, where you can actually see a lot of that architecture, and it is just mind-boggling. I think that's exactly what the disciples must have felt there with Jesus, looking at this massive, beautiful building that had taken decades to build. And they said, look at this beautiful building, Jesus. Isn't this incredible? And Jesus says, not one stone will remain on top of another. That must have been a shock to the disciples. They must have thought, what in the world is he talking about? And so, you wind up, they go and they think about it a little bit. And look in verse 3. Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, be real careful whenever you read verse 3. This is where a lot of people get in trouble, and this is where a lot of people do what we call overreading the Bible. You need to slow down and stop and ask a few questions. How many questions did the disciples ask? Did they ask one question? Is it two questions or three? What are they asking? What is it they're wanting to know? Well, if you really stop and look at the verse, you're going to notice a few things. I want you to notice that if you break it down into what it is, it says three different questions. He says, when, they ask, when will these things be? What are they talking about? Talking about what Jesus just said earlier, that these stones are going to be thrown down. Well, Jesus, when will this be? And then they go on, they want some more detail, and so they say, what will be the sign of your coming? Now notice, they actually add a third question in there. That third question, they say, and of the end of the age. Now, you could, by addition of just trying to understand what they're talking about, since they asked what will be the sign of your coming, and they use the word and, you could say, and the sign of the end of the age, or what is the end of the age? There's three different questions there. Now, that's the first thing you need to understand about studying a passage like this, is you need to look at your premise. What are we dealing with here? What are we talking about? Three questions, and what we're going to see is Jesus answers all three of those questions. He answers them directly. He says on the first one, let's answer that first question. All right, so Jesus, when will these things be? Well, in verses 24 through 28, Jesus begins to answer. And he answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. Such an important verse. No one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and I will deceive many, and you will hear wars and rumors of wars. And be not troubled. Now, before we go any further, you think about no one deceive you. This entire section, this entire chapter 24, be sure and listen to those words of Jesus. Don't let anybody deceive you on this. There have been lots and lots of people that have taken this passage and twisted it around and tried to make it say something that it doesn't say. One of the most famous ones was just recently in 2011. Harold Camping made a prediction that on May the 21st, 2011, Jesus is going to return. And he used this passage right here, as well as Daniel and a few others, to say, there it is. He's coming back May the 21st. May the 22nd, well, I was wrong. Let's make it October the 21st. October the 22nd, we're still here. And by the way, that wasn't the first time that he did that. He did it way back in 1994. Friends and brethren, I don't know about you, but the Bible tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 18, if a prophet says something's going to happen and it doesn't come true, what does that make him? A false prophet. I love this picture that I found of Harold Camping. I think it's great. That should be his punishment. I will not predict the future. I will not predict the future. Write that down 1,000 times. You can't predict the future. But Jesus did. Jesus is God on earth, and Jesus has an ability that no other human being has. And Jesus could look into the future, and he could say, this building will not last. Not one stone will stay upon the other. And not only could he see that, he could see the circumstances around it, and that's another important point you need to understand whenever you're studying this thing. Look at this, the way he describes it. He says you'll hear wars and rumors of wars. Now, that's a favorite. These doomsdayer predictors that like to say, oh, there it is. We're talking about, listen to the context. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom, verse 7, against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. And look what he says in verse 8, and these are the beginnings of sorrows. Now, whenever you consider the beginnings of sorrows, when did the beginning of sorrows start? Well, it started after the church began. And you go to Acts chapter 5, verse 20, you see that very thing take place. In Acts chapter 5, verse 40 rather, it says, and when they had agreed with them, and when they had called them and the apostles and beaten them, they commanded that they should not speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. So they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they had been counted worthy to suffer shame in his name. Friends and brethren, that's the beginning of persecution right there. The church begins in Acts chapter 2, and by the time you get to Acts chapter 5, they're being persecuted, they're being beaten, and then it gets worse and worse. You think about Acts chapter 7, what happened to Stephen, the first person to be killed because he wore the name Christian. And it continues there. You see in Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 9 where Paul, or Saul that is, made havoc of the church, the persecution. That's the beginning of the sorrows. He then goes on in verse 9, they will deliver you up in tribulation and kill you. Exactly what he said would happen. You'll be hated by nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended and betray one another and will hate one another. That happened. It kept getting worse and worse as the Roman government figured out that Christianity was not another part of Judaism. It was a separate religion. Then they began to persecute Christians more fiercely. So much so that they took those Christians and they used them as human torches. They put them in that Colosseum and fed them to lions and things like that. That's what he's talking about right here whenever you see this tribulation, these problems coming up. Many false prophets, he says, will arise and deceive many. And because of lawlessness will abound, love of many will grow cold. Yeah, people abandon the faith. Paul writes about that. So does some of the other apostles and the other writers of the New Testament talks about those people that abandoned him. Paul said that Demas has left and gone back to the present world. Everything that Jesus said happens. Verse 13, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel, this is an important verse. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. And then the end will come. I want you to put a pin right there. And go with me now to Jude chapter, well, there's only one chapter in Jude, but Jude 1. Verse 3. And look what it says. Beloved, while I was very diligent to write you concerning our common salvation, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith, listen to it, which was once for all delivered to the saints. Now, if that doesn't convince you, I want you to turn back to Colossians. Colossians chapter 1, verse 5 and 6, because of the hope which is laid up for you in heaven, of which you heard before the word of truth of the gospel. Listen to the words it says here, which has come to you as it also in all the world. Friends and brethren, the gospel had been preached to all the known world by the time that Colossians was written. Jesus says when it's been, go back now to verse 14, when the witness to nations, then the end will come when the gospel is preached to the world. So you kind of get an idea of what's going on here time frame wise. Therefore, verse 15, a very important verse, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let him understand. Then, verse 16, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. There's all kinds of context that you need to take into consideration whenever you're reading passages like this. It's this prophetic language, first of all. Second of all, you need to take into context. There is the immediate context. There is the overall context. There's also historical context. There is cultural context. So in the overall context, if you turn over to Luke chapter 21. Now, this is the problem I think a lot of people get into, is that they just look at Matthew, like Harold Campin did, and they just focus on that one section, and they think they have all the answers right there. Well, the Bible is its best commentary. And if you go to other passages, a lot of time it'll explain what something is. In Luke chapter 21, look with me in Luke chapter 21, verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded, this is the same context, by the way, of him talking about the same thing that's in chapter 24. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that the what? desolation is near. Now that explains what he's talking about when you see the abomination of desolation. Friends and brethren, it was an abomination for a Gentile to go into the temple. And what happened? Well, in 70 A.D., Titus of the Roman army, and the Roman armies had had enough of all these rebellious Jews. So they surrounded this city. And history teaches us in books like Josephus and the War of the Jews and things like that, that there was an interesting moment that Titus suspended the siege for a period of a few days, and that is the time that Christians were able to escape. Exactly what Jesus said would happen. Whenever he's warning them in Matthew chapter 24, let he is on the housetop not come down and take out of his house. Let him go first and don't go back, get your clothes. Woe to those who are pregnant. I pray your flight is not in the winter. In other words, get out of town when you see those armies, because the end is coming. And what do we see happen? According to history, and this is history outside of the Bible, we can see Jesus predicting the future. This is confirmed and written before A.D. 70. And in A.D. 70, every single thing that Jesus said came true. Those armies came, and guess what they did? They took those stones of that temple and they shoved them off of the top. So much force and so much you can see in that picture right there that they dented the concrete down below. You can still see those rocks today. That picture right there, still today, you can see those rocks, those stones on top of each other as testament that Jesus told the truth. That's not enough. You can go to Rome. And you can go to the Roman Forum. And right there in the back of the forum here, let me see if I can get my John Madden telestrator going on here. See that right there? That's the Ark of Titus. And if you go to the Ark of Titus and you look inside, you will see up inside there, let me get that off the screen, sorry. You will see inside there this picture or this carving, and if you look right up there, you'll see what looks like a candelabra or the candlestick. In other words, those Roman armies carrying away stuff that belongs to the temple. It's an abomination for a Gentile to go in the temple. Jesus says when you see the abomination of desolation, then get out of town. Do you understand what's going on right here? Jesus is telling the truth. He is telling them that this temple will be destroyed. You can mark my words. This is the truth. This is what's going to happen. I'm telling you right now that this is going to take place. But then he goes on and he answers their next question. Because they asked more than one question. And since you asked that question, then they said, what will be the sign of your coming? So Jesus continues. So that goes on in chapter 24. He goes down to verse 28. You get into verse 29, Jesus now answers the second question. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then, listen to the words. Don't overread the Bible. The sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then will all the tribes of the earth mourn. This is prophetic language. Now I want you to notice that Jesus says very clearly that the sign will come. Now this language that he's using is language that you see with the fall of nations. It sounds like he's talking about the end of the world or something like that, but what he's really talking about is the end of Judaism. He's talking about the end of that religious system that everybody had known. Now they rejected Jesus whenever he came here. They're not going to go peacefully, so the only way that this is going to end is to be destroyed. And that's exactly what winds up happening. And it's not surprising Jesus uses the same kind of language that's used in the Old Testament. When Isaiah, for example, talks about the destruction of nations, for the stars in the heaven and the constellations shall not give their light, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not cause her light. When he's talking about Idumea, Ezekiel uses the same type of language in Ezekiel 32. So you think about it, what does a war-torn, destroyed city look like? It looks like a darkened cloud. It looks like the end of the world. And to think about the despair and all that's in you, of course it's going to look like that. So he's describing it perfectly. So that religious system is going to be done away with. And I want you to think about how important that is. The Jews no longer are going to have that place on earth that represents God on earth. They're no longer going to have that place to go to. No longer are they going to be able to look up the genealogies to find out who can serve in that temple and where the Messiah is going to come from, because all that's been destroyed. You see the wisdom of God in that? God sent forth His Son. He has set forth now this new religious system, this Christianity. He's done away with the old, Colossians 2, verse 14, and now He has wiped it clean so that you can't go back to that. You want to really learn a lot about that, you need to be here on Wednesday nights. And Brother Jack's lessons that he's doing on Hebrews, where he's talking about those Christians that want to go back to Judaism. It was a problem. And here God takes care of it in one fell swoop. And so what's He talking about? Notice, Jesus didn't say, then will be my second coming. Then I will come back to earth or anything like that. Notice what He says. He says, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Then the tribes will mourn. What His answer is, everyone at that moment will finally acknowledge my coming, my first coming. Remember, they rejected Him. They didn't believe He was the Messiah. But whenever those Jews see that temple destroyed, it's going to teach them, they're going to see right then and there, He really was a prophet. What did I say a minute ago? Deuteronomy 18, if a prophet's word comes true, Jesus predicted the future, and so this is one more proof that Jesus is exactly who He said He is. He predicted this, and it happened exactly the way it would happen, and therefore He is the Messiah. And in that day, those words would come back to those people as they saw their city and their temple in flames and smoke, and they would realize He was the Messiah. He told the truth. Then He answers that third question. Now, this is an important point. In this third question, there is a transition. And just so you understand, look at the verse right before it. In verse 34, surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things are fulfilled. In AD 70, that's only 40-something years, approximately 40 years after Jesus lived on the earth, would there still be some people of that generation still alive that saw Jesus and heard Jesus and then see that take place? Yes. So therefore, the words that He said, it took place. That generation passes away. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words by no means will pass away. That Jewish system is gone. That whole system is gone, but are Jesus' words still with us today? Absolutely. Now, He answers the third question. But of that day, He's talking about a totally different thing now. Not talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Of that day, no one knows. Friends and brethren, take your pencil or whatever and circle that. No one knows. Harold Camping, anybody else who's ever predicted the future, no one knows. If God on earth says no one knows, but only my Father in heaven, then no one knows. It's interesting, the disciples, when they asked the question, they said, well, what of the age? They use a specific word there, and that word means eternity. It means that the whole of time. It can mean the world. They're asking, when will be the end of the world? Now, that's separate than the question about the temple. And so He answers that question with, no one knows. Of that particular, to answer that question, no one knows. Now, we've talked about all this, and that's all interesting, and we can spend a lot more time, and a lot of people do, spend a lot more time in that passage right there. And by way of introduction, now we get into the real part of the sermon. And you're thinking, what? Don't worry, we'll go through it fast. That's all interesting, but that's not what Jesus wants you to know. What Jesus really wants you to know are the following verses. Verses that began right here really in verse 37 all the way through the end of verse 25. And what He's talking about here is, listen, I'm going to paraphrase, Don't worry about all those signs. Yes, you need to be prepared for that day, but what you really need to be prepared for is to be prepared. You need to be prepared. And there are people that are not prepared, so what does he do? He begins this first section, verse 40, and really I like to add verse 37 in there, of the danger of no preparation. Listen to it. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and did not know until the flood came and took them away, so all the coming of the Son of Man shall be. Then look what he says. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding in the mill, one will be taken, one will be left. This is a picture of the saved and the lost and somebody not being prepared. Just like in the days of Noah, they weren't prepared. They were eating, they were going about their lives when all of a sudden the water started rising. That's what the Son of Man's coming will be like. When Jesus comes back, as is described here, one's going to be taken and one's going to be left. And friends and brethren, this harmonizes perfectly with Revelation. Revelation chapter 14, that talks about that harvest where he's going to come in and harvest up his saved. It also harmonizes perfectly with the end of chapter 25 when you got that separation. I don't know if any of you ever experienced real, deep, heartfelt anguish before. You know, I think of somebody who may have millions or something like that in the stock market, how they just, or maybe a loved one, when you've lost a loved one, or something just that deep anguish whenever you realize the reality of mortality hits you right square in the face. I don't want to be that person who's left behind. Can you imagine how that person's going to feel whenever in a field and all of a sudden, boom, up goes one. Now, I'm not talking about the rapture. There's no such thing as the rapture, by the way. That's a different study. We'll be glad to talk about that. But this is the way it's described. One's going to be taken, and what's going to happen to that person who's left behind? That gut feeling, I'm too late. I didn't prepare. Every knee is going to bow. Every tongue is going to confess. You're going to know in that moment. And there's somebody who's not prepared. Jesus doesn't stop with that. He continues teaching in the next section. In the next section, verse 45 through 51, this is danger of late preparation. This is the parable of the faithful and unfaithful servant. And what you have here is a servant who's not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Basically, what it boils down to is you have this, getting in my notes all confused here. You have this, one second. Okay. The faithful and unfaithful servant. And what we have here is a parable of the faithful Christian must be found doing what they're supposed to be doing. It comes back, and the reason that you have this parable is because basically what is said here is the servant thinks in his heart, but in that evil servant in his heart, my master, verse 48, my master is delaying in coming. That's the problem. You know, one of the worst things that a person can get in their mind is there's always tomorrow. Friends and brethren, we are not promised tomorrow. In fact, to live without watchfulness invites disaster. The most dangerous of all delusions is to think you have plenty of time. You know, that's why Jesus says no one knows. If he were to say, don't worry, he's going to come back on May the 21st, 2011, to use Harold Camping again, then all those people back in the year 70 AD or whatever it was, or whatever this time frame, they'd think, I ain't got to worry about it then. That's way on down the future. I'll just live my life. But because we don't know when God is coming, when Jesus is coming, I should say, then therefore it gives urgency that we need to be ready because he could come at any time. Could he come right now? Yes. Could he come 1,000 years from now? Yes. Doesn't change the fact that you need to be prepared. And so we need to be careful in thinking that we have tomorrow. Jesus continues. In chapter 25, he gets into now the danger of partial preparation. And I encourage you to go back and read these chapters because it'll be so important to understand all the words. But here we have that parable of the 10 virgins. And here he breaks it down into 5 versions that were wise and 5 versions that were foolish. He uses that word foolish for those who are not prepared. And what do we learn from this? It teaches us that we need to think or plan ahead. Now, Jesus is using the marriage customs of his day and age. A time whenever the groom would come in and his friends would bring him in. This was part of their custom. And then the celebration would begin. And so you have these 10 virgins. And the problem with the 10 virgins is that they could have been prepared. They had some oil. They're not asking too much of them. It's not something that's difficult or unexpected or anything outside the realm of normality. They just didn't prepare enough. It was partial preparation. Now there's another strong implication in this parable that a lot of people don't like to think about, and that is a portion of what many may consider good, clean, moral, respectable members of the church are going to be lost. And the reason being is because of partial preparation. Yes, you may be a member of the church. You may have obeyed the gospel call, and you may be sitting in the pew right there, and you may call yourself a Christian. But this parable right here, and other ones like Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, that verse that he talks about, and so many other verses that talk about, we have words like James chapter 1, verse 22, that says, "Be doers of the word, not hearers only." And there are good people sitting in the pews of the churches of Christ that are not going to make it to heaven. Because just like these foolish virgins here, all they had to do was be fully prepared. And unfortunately, they weren't. And that's a harsh, sad reality, but it's something that we need to learn that Jesus is talking about. And then finally, the last portion of the passage, beginning in verse 14, Jesus talks about the right preparation. Here he gives that parable of the talents. And we've heard this parable before where the owner gives 3 different guys, 3 different servants, a different measure. Don't get caught up in what the talent is and things like that. Just know that each one was given something a little bit different. Each one was given a different measure. And the point being was according to their ability. And so 2 of them did what they were supposed to do. That's the point of the parable. 2 did what they were supposed to do, what was expected of them. 1 did not do what was expected of him. God, again, gave them something according to their ability, and then they didn't do anything with it. Again, James chapter 1, verse 22. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12, that says, "By this time you are to be teachers, but instead you need to be taught the first principles." He's talking to Christians. He's talking to people who have already obeyed the gospel. And that's why Jesus teaches in Revelation chapter 2, verse 10, you need to remain faithful. Remaining faithful is not just sitting in the pew, y'all. Remaining faithful is being active and doing things that are working out your faith, working out your salvation, so that you can finally get to that last point, the result of being prepared. Again, I hope you'll go back and read these passages. I wish I had time to read the whole thing for you. But when you get to chapter 25, verse 31, that's when you get to that separation of the sheep and the goats. The whole point of this is all going back to that question in chapter 24. Whenever they said, what will be the end of the age? That's the important question. Yes, it's incredible that the temple was destroyed. Yes, it's incredible that all these things have happened, but the most important thing is that you're ready for eternity. And so he gives these 4 different parables of those not being prepared, those that are only partially prepared, and then those that should be prepared. And when you get to this point right here, what is the purpose? What is the reason for all this so that we can hear what that parable said? Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Do you want to hear those words? Do you want to hear those words? Amen? I want to hear those words. And so when Jesus is teaching this parable, teaching this, he's showing that he is the only way. There's not different paths to get there. In fact, if you're focused on a different path, then you're wasting time because Jesus is the only way. And whenever he's talking about being prepared, it's such an important lesson for us to learn. We're not talking about a storm because, there is destruction coming, y'all. There is destruction on the horizon. We're not talking about a hurricane or a storm. We're talking about eternity. There is going to come, as Jesus says, of that day, Judgment Day, a day when every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess. And in that day, if you are not prepared, you're going to hear the words, "Depart from me, you wicked servant." I hope that's not you. And I hope that you will have thought this morning about this, and you'll go back and you'll read those passages more and put them together in the way we've done that this morning. And see how important it is for you to be prepared. I want you to be prepared. I want you to be in heaven. I want to be in heaven. God wants you in heaven. And the way you do that is by hearing the gospel, believing that that Jesus is the Son of God, repenting of your sins, and then confessing His name, being baptized, which will add you to the church. But here's the whole point of all these parables and all this teaching this morning. Live faithfully and get that crown of life. Are you doing that? If you're not, then I pray that you'll think about it this morning. You'll make your life right with God. That if you have not been added to the church, that you'll do that this morning by following that gospel plan, in responding to the invitation of Christ. Or if you have wandered away from your first love and you think you might be in danger of partial preparation or something on those lines, man, make your life right with God. Do it today. Don't wait, because we don't have tomorrow. If we can help you in any way, please do so right now as together we stand and sing. Will you come?